This is Dr. Caroline Peterson and Natural Women's Health Institute in Sarasota, Florida. Today I'm talking about histamine, inflammation, and depression. Histamine is a monoamine along with serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And it has a special quality in that it's modulatory, which means that it can do more than one thing. It's very special. It's made out of an amino acid called histidine, and it has just a broad range of impact in our body on autonomic function, arousal, energy, sleep, body temperature, cognition, neurotransmission of inflammation, so many different things, and it's understudied. So it's one of the neurotransmitters that we don't understand very well. Its receptors, like itself, it's modulatory. So it has a lot of different impacts on a lot of different things. And its receptors are similar, where they're called heteroreceptors because they can do a lot of different functions, not just for histamine, but for other neurotransmitters too. And there's 4 different receptors for histamine. H1 is for the neurons, smooth muscles. We know this is one that's kind of like typical that people think about. It's for all of the kind of allergy responses that people get with their airways, like the coughing, the sneezing, that kind of thing. It impacts blood vessels, GI, the heart. So like this is the pathway like for anaphylaxis, so that you can have heart palpitations and things like that. It impacts the adrenal gland and the skin. So this is like where you get with the rashes, the itchiness, stuff like that for allergies. The H2 receptor is in the tummy. And so that's the one that they use to stop the hydrochloric acid secretion. So like the pepsid is a H2 inhibitor. It also works on other types of smooth muscle cells and the heart as well. H3 works on the central nervous system. And so it not only has something to do with histamine, of course, but also with the other monoamines, dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, which is also called norepinephrine. And then additionally, acetylcholine, which is not a monoamine, but it's impacted here with histamine. The 4th receptor is for the bone marrow, and that's like where the blood cells are born. So this has to do with the blood cells and immune system and things like that. So this is another way to kind of like look at it. The H1, H2, H3, H4. We talked about the heteroreceptors, primarily for neuronal functions and cognition. Many other types of non-histamine and even histamine receptors are autoreceptors, so that they just do like themselves. Like they're like, welcome home, just to me, nobody else. And so these are also the other types of cells that are related to histamine, and we'll be going into some of these more. So like I was mentioning, the H1 receptors, those are the ones that we're probably most familiar with for allergic symptoms and things like that. So the anaphylaxis, the fast beating heart, the getting flushed, feeling like I can't breathe, the asthma, getting the runny nose, the itchy skin, the breakouts on your skin, the pink and watery eyes. And then it also does impact food intake, sleep-wake cycles, thermal regulation. So hippocampus in the brain, hypothalamus in the brain, and movement, memory and learning. And then when we look at the immune system, we're looking more at Th1 component of the immune system for this one. The H2 receptors, like we were talking about before, that has a lot to do with the gut. So people are familiar with the hydrochloric acid secretion, pepsid, And then this is also working on the smooth muscles. So making sure that they stay open so you can breathe. And this one is the H1 has TH1, H2 is more related to TH2. That's easy to remember, right? Um, and so this one is related to the cytokine release in the acute phase. And so that's an inflammatory response to histamine. This also has to do with responding to bacteria and natural killer cells, and also impactful on the lung and the gut. So we know now that inflammatory bowel disease, inflammatory bowel syndrome are related to histamine and other neurotransmitters. H3 is the one that has more to do with the central nervous system. Again, all the monoamine neurotransmitters, in addition to acetylcholine. And this is where we see involvement with the mast cells, for instance. And we'll be talking more about those later. And then the cerebral neurons, so the nerves in the brain. The H3 receptors are related to inhibition of sympathetic vasoconstriction. So that means that they would stop vasoconstriction in the nasal mucosa so it doesn't get too little. The little arteries don't get too little. H4 is the one that's probably the least researched and is related to inflammatory disorders and autoimmune diseases. So that's one that has to be researched more, and it's kind of the most closely related to the H3 in the central nervous system. So this is the way it works for the breakdown. We start with that amino acid histidine, and that's broken down into the monoamine neurotransmitter histamine. And then histamine is broken down by two different pathways, HNMT or DAO. And so the HNMT is intracellular, the DAO is extracellular. And so these are functional in different ways in different parts of the body. So the HNMT is responsible for most of the breakdown of histamine, and that's because most of histamine should be intracellular. And so we see this one in the airways, central nervous system, the intestinal smooth muscles and mucosa, the liver, and the kidneys, all inside of the cell. The DAO is responsible for less of the breakdown of histamine because it's outside of the cells, but it's kind of in similar areas, the small intestine mucosa, the liver, kidney, and then also the eosinophils, placenta, and skin. So all metabolic pathways need helpers. And the helpers help the, the breakdown process go smoothly, and can generally speed it up. Occasionally will slow it down. So for histamine in the intracellular pathway, the HTMN pathway, it needs B6, SAMe from the methylation cycle, FAD, which is also related to the thyroid, and zinc, vitamin C, NAD, which is related to the kyuranine pathway, which we'll talk about a little more later, and B1. In the extracellular pathway, which is the DAO pathway, we also need the B6. We need the FAD related to the thyroid, got to have a healthy functioning thyroid. The calcium, this time we need copper. And then again, zinc, vitamin C, NAD, which is nice form of niacin, and B1. Okay, so this is the breakdown of histamine intracellularly. So using the HNMT pathway. This is a nice slide because it tells us what things speed up and slow down different metabolic processes. So the purple is slowing down, the yellow is speeding up, and then somewhere along the way, you're going to see the blue, which are the cofactors. So here's B5, for instance, zinc, B3, for instance. So let's say you're having a big histamine reaction. So the first thing we want to do is to stop making more histamine, right? So histamine is made out of histidine. So we want to slow down this part of the pathway, right? And so if we want to slow it down, then, oh, look here, histamine will slow it down. So the body's smart. The body is like, hey, I've got a lot of histamine. I don't want to make more right now. So I'm going to start slowing this down myself. Other things you could add would be green tea, because that's the thing that has EGCG in it. Grapefruit and coffee will do it. Most people would be glad to know that. And then, of course, like quercetin and curcumin are the things that many people would take to treat high histamines. And so, yep, they slow down the histidine to histamine conversion. So that's really awesome. So the things that you would want to avoid so that you will prevent histidine being converted to histamine would be hydrogen peroxide. Well, you're not really going to control that. That's going to be more like other pathways that are making that in your body. Bile inflammation. Well, that's awesome to avoid inflammation, right? Avoid infections, avoid the lipopolysaccharides, which are also like inflammatory viruses. Oh, that's inflammation too. High stress, well, that's inflammation. Okay, well, we're getting an idea here. Too much exercise or intense exercise is inflammatory. Lack of sleep is inflammatory. So basically, avoid the stuff that creates inflammation. And that will help to slow down the conversion of histidine to histamine. That's pretty awesome, right? And so then we can think, now, if you got the histamine going on, then we want to speed it up. So that's the yellow from here. We want to speed things up. So that's like the vitamin A, the B5, being a male, which, I mean, what can you do about it? Either you are or you aren't. That'll speed it up. That at this point, we'll see things will be sped up, vitamin C, and being a female down here, that'll speed it up. Inflammation will speed it up down here. Chronic stress, and that's for the MAO, the monoamine oxidase A and B. That'll speed up their action. It's a little confusing, because now here we have, the opposite effect. Caffeine is going to slow down this process, where it slows down that process, but we want it slowed down. So in general, caffeine is going to slow down things, kind of counterintuitive. But so basically, if you're having a histamine reaction, you may not want to take caffeine, because it's gonna make a clunky system. Things that slow down, that have opposite effects, creating histamine and breaking it down, are things that are gonna make the pathway clunky. So you kind of want to stay away from that stuff as much as possible, and go with the stuff that is consistent and makes the pathway run more smoothly. So people are usually pretty surprised that only about 5% of the circulating histamine in the body is actually related to food that we eat or bacteria that we have in our bodies that produce histamines. Because most of the histamine therapeutic recommendations are about food. It's about decreasing histamine that you take into your body, or things that will liberate histamines and stuff like that. So it's surprising that only about 5% of the histamine in your body is actually related to food. And we know that the low histamine diet is only addressing a small portion of histamine, because that's only going to have an impact on the extracellular histamines. Surprisingly, the low FODMAPs diet could actually be a little more impactful for histamines than the low histamine diet, and that's possibly because it deals more generically with inflammatory processes, um, and that has a greater impact on mast cell activation and liberation of the intracellular histamine. Foods that are high in histamine are basically old foods. So fermented foods, alcohol is like fermented, or it's old grapes, basically dried fruit, and then citrus, eggplant, avocados, anything that's kind of like preserved. So it could be any kind of these processed meats, the dried meats, the canned meats, any kind of old cheese, and then some of the fish can go bad more easily. So you would want to avoid the tuna, the herring, mackerel, stuff like that. And then beans, right? They're old, they're dried, they're not fresh. Whether it's peanuts or soy products, those are all things that are going to be high in histamine, because histamine is formed as stuff sits around. So it's better to go with fresh stuff. FODMAPs is a little bit hard diet. It's the tasty seasoning that we have. So it's the stuff that that has like the complex sugars in them, things like that. So garlics, onion, broccoli, cabbage, beets, apples, and then not actually the meats and fish themselves, but if they're battered or breaded, because this is more to do with like the grains and that that are used for the battering and the breading, and then the actual meats and fish themselves. And then the dairy will have some of the sugars in them that can ferment, and some of the beans, again, the soy. So we're seeing the beans and the soy in both camps. Some of the alcohols, and some of the teas. The nice thing about especially like the FODMAPs is that it's mostly about portion size, so that just don't eat too much, and you can stay in a low FODMAPs with many different things, not like the onions and garlic. Those are like, you don't want to eat those will have an impact. But a lot of the other foods, if you just eat a smaller portion and don't eat it every day, then the body's more tolerant of that. So the enterochromaffin cells are the cells inside of the intestine that make the serotonin. And they're both part of the enteroendocrine, or the intestinal endocrine system, and the neuroendocrine system. So they have multiple functions. And part of the function of serotonin is to increase and regulate motility and secretion of the digestive fluids. And so serotonin is going to have a big impact on digestion. And the way that it's kind of like turned on, these enterochromaffin cells are turned on by mechanical stimulation. So like the bolus of food, when you eat the food and it gets into the crypts of the intestine where the enterochromaffin cells are, they'll be like, oh, something's happening here. I'm going to release some serotonin because we got to get that food moving on. There's also neurologic and chemical components, so that these cells are able to really sense into their environment and respond with serotonin production dependent on what's going on in their environment. So histamine also is related to these enterochromaffin cells. So histamine is going to impact acetylcholine, and then acetylcholine is going to impact serotonin. serotonin production in the enterochromaffin cells. So we have a little bit of a tag team going on here. So when we have higher acetylcholine, when we have higher histamine, that's going to increase acetylcholine, which is going to cause the serotonin to either have more or less secretion from the enterochromaffin cells dependent on the microbiome. So like we talked about before, we have these different histamine receptors and they're sensitive to different things. They're in different parts of the body. They are related to some of the other neurotransmitters. And they have a very, very broad impact on the body in general. So this is the enterochromaffin cell here inside of the intestinal epithelium in the gut, right? And so there's going to be the impact of, so 5-HT is serotonin. And so that's going to be released, and that's going to have an impact on the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve has efferent goes out, afferent comes into the brain. So vagal afferent is bringing information from the gut to the brain. And so the vagus nerve will carry it up into the spinal cord. And then we're going to have an impact on the brain and the perception of pain, for instance, and the body will respond in the descending pathway to regulate the gut. So serotonin has a big impact on pain, and it's actually is part of the venom of different insects and spiders and things like that. And so that's why a lot of people with serotonin issues are going to have pain in their belly, because it can cause a lot of pain on its own. So histamine receptors, the H3 receptors, those are the ones that are the central nervous system receptors. They are they regulate the serotonin transporters because you want to make sure that serotonin is getting into that synapse and out of the synapse. And so the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, block the serotonin transporters to keep more serotonin in the synaptic cleft so that it can have an impact longer. And so it's kind of like these two things, histamine and SSRIs, are kind of like both trying to work on the same pathways in different ways. The histamine 3 receptor inhibits the release of histamine, serotonin, dopamine, GABA, and acetylcholine. And when it's antagonized or kind of like blocked, then it can cause it's good support for people who are anxious and depressed. It helps them feel better. So this is a little picture of HA means histamine. H3R is the histamine 3 receptor. So you can see here's a receptor, histamine is plugging in, then it's released into the cleft, received by another histamine receptor that is on 5-HT is serotonin. So it's on the serotonin terminal. Serotonin terminal has histamine receptor on it. That histamine receptor is going to have an impact on the actual like histamine release into, the serotonin release into the synaptic cleft, and also have a release on the serotonin transporter here, which ultimately will have an impact on the extracellular serotonin levels. Histamine has this impact on serotonin, and higher levels of histamine are associated
with lower levels of serotonin. And that in part has to do with inflammation, the inflammatory component of histamine. Because inflammation provokes more histamine, histamine provokes more inflammation, and this is how we get less serotonin. So for a long time, decades and decades, the dominant theory of how to address affective disorders and depression has been the monoamine theory. So the idea that if we don't feel good, if we're depressed or anxious or something like that, then that's because we don't have enough serotonin or dopamine or, things like that. And so this has not been borne out to be true by meta-analyses, although many people feel a benefit, at least short term. There are also complications with the therapeutic interventions using the monoamine theory to treat depression or anxiety. And so now there's a new theory, which is the cytokine theory of affective disorders, depression, and anxiety, which says that it's really inflammation that's promoting these changes in affect. And that too is a theory that has limitations. And so what we know is that we're trying to be too reductionistic. Neither theory has adequate explanatory value, so we need to combine them or look further. We need to not be satisfied with one or the other. Perhaps both combined make sense. And there could be other components that we're not aware of yet. So we know that inflammation and depression generally show up together in a person. We know that it makes sense because when there's inflammation, you're going to have less serotonin and there's going to be increased histamine. So it's this like little cycle. And then we're going to have alterations in neurotransmission and in brain function. One of the things about histamine is that when we have high histamine, it will cause the blood-brain barrier to erode. That will lead to increased brain inflammation and then infiltration of either organisms like viruses or fungi. It could be other things too, like heavy metals. It can be a lot of different things that get into the brain that should not be in there. And then this can also be a component of depression. So we always want to check for the blood-brain barrier breach because high histamine can erode that. And then we're going to have a lot of other problems that don't really have anything to do with neurotransmitters. So perhaps this is one of the things that's going on. And that's why we find that it's not really just like low neurotransmitters that are causing the problem. Again, there's quite a lot of research that talks about how depression is associated with inflammation. And a number of the studies have looked particularly at the cytokines that are related to histamine.
So mast cells are one of the places, they're the major place that holds histamines in the body. They're mediators between the nervous system and the immune system. They transmit pain and they are part of the immune system. They're part of making new blood vessels and stabilizing tissue, breakdown, regeneration, that whole cycle. They have a lot of different receptors on them for nitric oxide, hydrogen sulfide, GABA, dopamine, glutamine, even opioids. And their main thing that we're interested about now is when mast cells are activated, they'll release histamine. It's unclear right now exactly how mast cells are regulated. The research is a little bit contradictory. And so there seems to be some involvement of the autonomic nervous system, but the research right now is a little bit conflictory. Both the vagus nerve and acetylcholine are part of the parasympathetic nervous system. So something's going on there, and we're not asking the right questions, or we don't have big enough samples. We're not getting consistent findings, and so right now there's something going on with the parasympathetics, but it's not quite clear what it is. And there is a little bit more consistency about nitric oxide inhibiting degranulation. Mast cell activation syndrome is something which is becoming more recognized and is a kind of like an exaggerated normal response of the mast cells, because it's like they become too sensitive and they respond too quickly to triggering, and this response is extensive and ongoing, and can have devastating effects for the body because it's inflammation. So mast cell activation has a standard kind of allergic type of responses: the itch, the rash, runny nose, sneezing, perhaps even anaphylaxis. But then there's other symptoms. These are like the more vague symptoms that are hard to figure out, what's actually going on. Fatigue, palpitations. You could have constipation or diarrhea or both. You could have pain in the belly, pelvic pain, endometriosis, vulvodynia, bladder pain, overactive bladder, problems sleeping, anxiety, depression. And then POTS is becoming like a really big thing, as well as just autonomic dysfunction in general. The whole body is kind of just going crazy, like it's just forgot its home base. Mast cells are also related to irritable bowel syndrome. Folks who have the irritable bowel syndrome have more mast cells than others, and they also have lower levels of the DAO, that is the enzyme or gene that breaks down histamine in the extracellular environment. And this, when there's less enzyme to break down the histamine, then what happens is that the mast cells can be activated, just because now there's more histamine. They have histamine receptors, their histamine inside. Just becomes this crazy situation. So mast cells also have estrogen receptors. What don't they have, right? They got it all. So high estrogen can also contribute to the degranulation of the mast cells, which means when they release the histamine. And of course, endocrine disruptors are all kind of like estrogens, right? Environmental estrogens, whether it's in plastics or fire retardants or stain resistant food packaging. And these all are things that can act as estrogens and bind to estrogen receptors. So basically, the mast cells are being hit hard because who can get away from these types of endocrine disruptors in our environment? They're just everywhere. It's just super hard not to be exposed to them. Also, the mast cells are very sensitive to inconsistency. So that in perimenopause, you get a lot of fluctuations of estrogen over a short period of time, not over 30 days, but over 30 minutes. And this also increases the susceptibility of the mast cell to degranulation. So estrogen also, it can increase the number of mast cells. So you have this kind of like feedback system between estrogen and the mast cells, where estrogen activates the mast cells, the histamine activates the estrogen. So it's just back and forth, back and forth. And then because of their ability to create more vasculature, to, because they're inflammatory. The mast cells are also thought of being a component of endometriosis. Also because, menstrual migraines are related to a drop in estrogen. The dural mast cells are thought to be related to menstrual migraines by vis-a-vis the estrogen. And then estrogen also, man, it's like so many whammies, right? Estrogen also can decrease the amount of the enzyme that breaks down the extracellular histamine. And so then that will lead to more histamine. So it's just a very complex situation. And especially now when our world is so estrogen rich, that we're not just dealing with the estrogen that we make, we're dealing with the estrogen that's just a part of our environment. Lots of histamine, lots of mast cell activation. So the mast cells also have progesterone receptors on them. And progesterone can activate histamine release also. But their story is a little bit more complex or less consistent because they can also help to stabilize the mast cells. So it's one of those things where uh, progesterone and histamine and mast cells is a little bit like we need more research because we don't quite understand how all of this comes together. Anytime you see things that look contradictory, then it just means that we need more research, we need broader research, we need to ask better questions. So short chain fatty acids like butyrate and vitamin D are really important for stabilizing mast cells. This is what we need in an environment that's highly estrogenic, with a lot of histamine disrupting the mast cells. So, like I said before, it's kind of funny that even though the food component of histamines is only 5%, the diet is what we use, as one of the ways that we intervene. The other way that we intervene is helping to either sop up the histamine or break down the histamine in the through the intracellular histamine pathway or the extracellular histamine pathway using the enzymes. We don't have an HMNT enzyme at this point, but we do have the DAO, either from a pig or the plant. And then working to stabilize the mast cells with the butyric acid or the vitamin D, and to decrease the immunologic response with Mangista. There are probiotics that are related to histamine. Some probiotics will produce histamine, and so if you're in this like histamine intolerant or mast cell activating state, then you want to avoid the ones that the probiotics that might be good in other settings, but not now, because they can produce histamines. And then even the non-histamine producing probiotics can, if you have irritable bowel syndrome, which is the constipating variety, then you may not want to take even the non-histamine producing probiotics that have a tendency to downregulate serotonin and be more likely to cause constipation. So you may want to avoid the Lactobacillus rhamnosus and the Bifidobacterium longum, just because they tend to be more constipating in relationship to serotonin activity. It's kind of weird and complicated. So in general, we don't know enough about histamine. It needs to be studied more. It can have system-wide impact on Other monoamines, acetylcholine, depression, anxiety, inflammation, the GI tract, central nervous system, autonomic nervous system, respiratory, cardiovascular, reproductive, like it's just so pervasive in the body. But thankfully we can stabilize things in part by looking at the diet, enzymes, cofactors, probiotics, and immunologic support, and maybe even the autonomics. I mean, it makes sense if we can get into the parasympathetics, everything looks better. So to work with histamine too.